So let's finish up this talk with these deep sea things before we get to talking about fisheries and fisheries management by talking about how these two things interplay. So we've spent some time now talking about the guys down deep and in the water column, etc. Let's talk about how these guys interact together. We'll talk a little bit about the ecology of these things and then talk about the connection between the shallow and the deep. So as we talked about, we're talking about the area that's down dark, right? So the aphotic zone. So the rule of thumb we mentioned last time, which was happening just when the fire alarm went off. So just in case that wasn't clear, we're talking about the area greater than 200 meters. The aphotic zone can move a little bit depending on where we are on the planet and if we're near a sediment-rich river mouth or something, but suffice it to say, pretty much you hit 200 meters and below, you're going to be in dark all the time, where the only naturally occurring light would be bioluminescence. And so, as we mentioned before, this is the vast majority of the living space on planet Earth. We haven't talked too much about this, but suffice it to say, very hard to get here, right? So I've shown you guys some videos and we've seen some documentaries that are really, really cool, but that's an incredibly expensive undertaking to send equipment down there, submarines down there, ROVs down there. So it's very difficult to study. So we just don't go there very frequently, so we don't know that much about what's going on. This is another one of those numbers it's hard to know exactly, but if you were to add up all the cores that people have taken, all the drags of the bottom of the ocean and this and that, we're talking on the order of a few square kilometers. A minor fraction. So the analogy that's often used is people trying to learn about North America by floating over North America in a balloon where there's fog underneath you so you can't see, and dropping down a bucket, like a Home Depot bucket with a rope, and dragging and pulling it up and like trying to learn about the ecology of our continent from that, right? Very similar to, of course you can learn some things, you get some pine needles and go, oh my gosh, there's plants down there, but it's hard to piece together the dramatic and complex and amazing ecosystems that we have just from that type of an approach. We're really still in the pattern and discovery, hunting patterns and trying to document patterns and figuring out what the shape of that fish does and where this guy lives and where this one eats, right? This is crazy given that this is becoming one of the areas we're shifting our fishing pressure to. So one of our great management challenges is we're going deeper and deeper, be that to extract resources like nodules or oil or gas, or biological resources like fish. If we don't understand what the natural condition is or what the extant condition is before we start messing with it, it's going to be hard to know what the magnitude of our impact is, right? But yet that's where we are. Historically, we've really viewed the bottom of the ocean as boring and as not very interesting and as a desert, if you will. So not worthy of our attention. And that's allowed folks to do things like dump nuclear reactors into the ocean. That's allowed folks to drop waste into the ocean. And don't worry too much about it. The reality is it's not impoverished. It's not as densely populated as some of our other areas are per unit area or something, but it's still a key important part of our planet. People have historically sampled this by using things that drop down, a trap, if you will, and then trap on the bottom. You take a bite out of the bottom in some way, shape, or form. You can do that with box cores. You can do that with sleds, things that drag along the bottom. In more recent years, we've focused on somewhat less alternative methods. Things like towing camera arrays, either just a naked camera, as we're building in the room behind us for take out to the islands in a short period, or whether we're using actual ROVs and more articulate robots that we can take samples. We also use submarines, although submarines mostly aren't that interesting. Submarines are very expensive. They're very costly. The logistics of you and I having to get the air we need to breathe, generally speaking, it's not worth us doing that. It's much more cost effective to send down robots. As you guys have already identified from that exercise we just did, right? It's this aphotic zone is first and foremost dark. It's cold. What's the average temperature, you guys? What's that?
3 degrees.
Yep, about 3 degrees Celsius. So it's pretty uniformly cold on average. Relatively not big swings in salinity because we're not near the mouths of rivers, not near the surface of the ocean where we can have evaporation or something like that. And as you saw from that video we watched earlier, it's more or less mostly covered in this rain of organic stuff, this sediment, these piles of sediment. The more we look, the more we find that the gross biodiversity is similar to the stuff in our shallower regions, the things we're more familiar with, our kelp forests and our coral reefs and stuff like that. There's just different species. So we have mollusks up here, they have mollusks down there. We have cnidarians up here, they have cnidarians down there. The key difference is down deep, we don't have any phototrophic primary producers. No guys that generate their energy from sunlight. The primary producers that do exist are chemotrophs, chemoautotrophs. Most of the nutrients that we're going to get are going to be imported. So with the exception of these areas right around the hydrothermal vents, most of all that nitrogen, whatever we need, is going to be imported from afar. It's going to drift down from the photic zone. We didn't understand this until relatively recently, but just like that myth that persisted that the bottom of the ocean, the deep ocean, is a desert, is boring, is not worthy of our attention, is not worthy of our active management or concerns over management, no matter what we did. That also, that incorrect thinking also led to thinking not only is it monotonous in terms of the critters, it's monotonous in terms of temporal variation. It's just as unchanging. It's sort of ancient time. And while there is some truth to that, we now recognize there are seasonal pulses of stuff. The bottom of the seafloor has relatively low biomass, as you guys saw, with the exception of some of these hotspot areas like hydrothermal vents. But it does have relatively high biodiversity. Do not understand why. So we do not understand why we have the biodiversity patterns that we have on Earth. We have these consistent patterns that we do see, but as far as the mechanisms that produce that diversity, ecologists have not come to any unified theories. So the seafloor is one of the pieces of evidence that people trot out as to suggest that biomass isn't necessarily correlated with diversity, as some people would suggest. As you guys also have seen, most of the deep sea critters are eating things from elsewhere. Here's some of those guys. You've seen some of these before. All kinds of worms. These guys are our vestiminiferous worms right here. These hydrothermal vent guys. Polychaetes, cnidarians, all kinds of really cool sponges. Lots of echinoderms. Lots of cool echinoderms. So there's crinoids, like you can see here in the middle of photo, there's all kinds of brittle stars, as up in the upper right. There's all kinds of funky sea urchins, as on the lower left. Lots of neat snails, lots of neat mollusks, like squids, but also clams, and all kinds of really cool bivalves. Lots of crustaceans. Things like this, look at that isopod on the left. So that, remember we talked about that gigantism? Normally, or more commonly, our isopods are small. Our isopods are like a roly-poly, or a lot of times way smaller even than that. This dude, look at that, look at the hand there for scale. That's a honkin' crustacean. Barnacles, the guys on the upper right, like the amphipods, the yeti crab on the lower left, all kinds of crazy cool stuff. This guy is just one example. This guy has these freaky claws. Check it out. One of his legs is, or one of his pinchers is relatively small. The other is huge. So this guy's from about 300 meters down off the Philippines. And, you know, again, another example of we don't understand the natural history of these critters, but really trippy. We've looked at a lot of those pictures of the fish. Like the hatchet fish on top, these gulper eels and basket eels on the right, all these kind of crazy lured fish, tripod fish, these gulper eels, all kinds of cool stuff. Here's a bunch of cool cusk eels feeding on some, something dead. In this case, this is from a deep sea trench. So this is pretty deep in the water. This is this funky sailfish, also from really deep down. As we said, there's no primary productivity down deep except for right at those vents. We have a low input of organic carbon. Most of it comes down as this rain of stuff. We get these pulses of fish bodies and stuff, but there's also this background rain of stuff that drifts down. Okay, so here we go. So here's the new conceptualization of what's going on. Oops, sorry guys, can't quite see this. Here's the new diagram as to what we think is going on with the deep ocean, how it is coupled with our shallower realms of the ocean. So we have vegetation, primary producers, macroscopic primary producers that just fall into the water and sometimes get waterlogged and sink. That would be stuff like wood products. That would be stuff like terrestrial vegetation, etc. Then we get things like our benthic algae, our macrocystis, giant kelp, stuff like that. Those guys go down. Working our way from the left side of the diagram to the right, then we have these migrations, which we've not talked about yet, but we do have these critters that move up and down with the light. So we have the high productivity areas, right in the shallow. That's where the sun is. That's where we have a lot of our phytoplankton growing. So some of these grazers, for example, might want to come up and graze on those primary producers. But if they were to come up in the daylight, apparently a lot of them don't do well. They come up in the daylight, they get eaten. So they'll come up at night. So as the sun sets, the largest migration on Earth is in the ocean every day when the sun rises or sets. So you have these critters that come up from below, come to the shallows, spend their time up high in the day, in the nighttime, and then go back down during the daytime. So we have this movement up down. We have phytoplankton. We've already talked about that. We've talked about that as a source for a lot of our silicaceous ooze and those other sediments that you guys have seen around the benthos of the world of the earth. We have cast off dense structures from critters. Most conspicuously, they're exoskeletons. They chunk off, and those guys will drift down. Increasingly, our management actions are a source of materials into the deep sea, with so-called fish dumping or bycatch one of the possible sources. So we go out and we're only allowed to catch certain species by our management rules, but we incidentally or by not paying too close attention capture a lot of other things that we either don't want, can't want, or for what other reason want to get rid of. We throw those over the side, and a lot of that is eaten by birds and things right off the edge of the boat. But when you're dumping large volumes, these things sink down and they can make it to the bottom. So our cast-offs can be are currently an important source of carbon and other things down to the bottom. Then we get the stuff that happens when big critters die, like a whale. When a whale dies, he's going to sink. He might rot at first and float a little bit, but eventually he's probably going to sink. And then there's a lot of poop that floats down to the bottom too. Very exciting. So guys that are living down deep have all these various deep sea energy inputs. The typical inputs are going to be things like here, like the molt, phytoplankton, not very high quality energy and biological molecules. We've thought historically that these inputs of high energy things, like let's say a whole whale or let's say a whole tuna, that import to the bottom has been unusual and is so-called atypical. It's unclear if that's really true or not as we look closer and closer. So again, originally thought to be wherever the tuna fish dies. I keep saying tuna fish. What the hell's wrong with me? When the tuna die, they sink. And maybe the tuna are over by Japan, maybe they're by Hawaii, maybe they're by California. So there's no real pattern to the input, right? And it's basically a random luck of the draw as to where it goes. But the more we've looked at it, there does seem to be some kind of spatial structure. In other words, that there's some areas that on average get more input of this high quality, high value stuff from the shallow waters than you would think otherwise. Similarly, same story goes with temporal variation. We thought historically it was just sort of random. This happens sometimes, happens others. Now we're starting to see potentially some strong seasonal signals and also some potentially strong signals of storms, typhoons and stuff. And so one of the ways you can get a strong structure is something like this. We see here are some simplified migration patterns of some of the great whales. So if these whales are more likely than not traveling on this corridor right here or whatever, on average we're going to tend to have a lot of, when we do have whales dying, they're going to die somewhere, let's say in the blue band, right? Or the green band or the yellow band or whatever, relative to the whole of planet Earth. So it's maybe not quite as varied as we thought. Just like we've seen in the intertidal and some of those places, we do see some zonation. There's zonation with depth, most obviously with the things that utilize light and things that don't utilize light. But we also see zonation near hydrothermal vents. Let's skip this. Okay, so particular organic matter is going to be the highest. Everybody with me here? Here we are. So here is depth. So here is the shallow surface waters, relatively high particular organic matter. A lot of life in the waters up shallow. A lot of dissolved stuff, a lot of little small pieces of stuff, all that jazz. And as we go deeper, we tend to see a decay of that organic material. And so this is the pattern we see, interestingly. So so amount of biomass, same, but species diversity seems to peak at intermediate depths. We don't fully understand why. So again, that biodiversity prediction of some folks, some hypotheses people have postulated about where we see biodiversity and what's driving it. A lot of people have spent a lot of time working on productivity as a key explainer of biodiversity. That doesn't seem to be working so much in the deep sea. The hydrothermal vents, we get a lot of this nice zonation. And we go from lots of life really close up to the edge. And then as we get farther back, we get different things. I'd like to show, there's a Yeti crab. We can get relatively high diversity, especially near some of our hydrothermal vents. We see the difference between, say, like our coral reef, where we see certain things like cnidarians, like coral dominating. We don't see, while we might have a lot of species in an area in the bottom of the ocean, we don't tend to see high dominance. And we think that might be because of strong competition and pretty extreme niche diversification because of the low amounts of food that are down there, but we're not sure. Yeah, we'll skip that. Okay, what's this? Any guesses? What's that? I can't hear you guys. What's again? Oh, that's an octopus in the dead center. But what's the thing? What's the main thing in the picture? Of? Yeah, it's a whale skull. So you guys are looking at a whale skull. So check it out. Not going any slides further. Look at the ground. What's the color of the ground there? Red, all kinds of stuff. What does that tell us? There's critters around, right? Look at the water. There's all kinds of the flash picture that the photographer, the robot, whatever it was, took the picture of. There's all kinds of there's all kind of stuff in the water, right? Reflecting back. There's stuff in the water. There's stuff on the ground. There's octopus. There's all kinds of these things on this area. So these whale falls are huge explosions of life on the bottom of the ocean. And again, like I said before, we actually are now discovering these whale falls follow certain patterns similar to the whale migrations in the shallower waters, right? So they're tracking that. Again, this is, what do I want to say here? Okay, so we do have some constant things. Some of the phytoplankton stuff going, some of the planktonic critters, you might want to, maybe we could think of those as typically the sort of background level of stuff dying in the shallows and going down deep. But then we have these spikes of biomass and spikes of resources that cruise down into the bottom from things like dying large-bodied animals or dying large chunks of plants after a hurricane maybe. And then also we have these holes in the bottom of the ocean that come up through these vent systems that can provide sort of atypical inputs to the deep as well. People have started to do some serious good science on this. And this is some efforts where we found some dead whales and we've taken samples of their whale bones and aged them using radioisotopes and the like. And what you find is this. So here on the x-axis we have age. So we go from just deposited on the bottom of the ocean or just arrived at the bottom of the ocean to a sample that's about a century old. And we see this pretty even distribution of these bones. These bones, or these carcasses, seem to follow a pretty consistent pattern that's emerging over time. That thing on the right there is a hagfish. That's a major scavenger in the bottom of the ocean. So the first thing that happens is something like a whale dies and it sinks. Boom, it goes to the bottom. first thing that happens are these very mobile, active scavengers, big-bodied scavengers that arrive really quickly, that arrive within days to weeks to maybe at the most months, but probably more like weeks. So these guys come in and they eat all of the good blubber and the good muscle mass, the tasty stuff, if you will, right? So they rip off all that jazz. Next, those big dudes run out of food, so they take off. Then we start to see explosions of the microbial population that start breaking down some of the lipids and some of the other compounds from the whale. And then we see the invertebrates start to come up because they start feeding off the bacteria. And this happens over the scale of months to years. And then, even with whales, we get some of these species that are attracted to sulfur. And this takes over, this is more like years, but some of those substances in the bones, some of those fats, etc., will release sulfides, rotten egg smell that you might recognize as the whale carcass continues to decompose. And we can see this essentially very similar to some of the critters that live around the hydrothermal vents. Those critters come in and populate the area. And then eventually all that material completely degrades and it decays back to the background condition, the relatively less abundant critter condition of the background ocean. And this is what that looks like in cartoon phase from some of our friends at University of Hawaii. So we have these large, this is the first phase, right? So we have these large mobile scavengers, the hagfish, the big sharks coming in, eating the dead whale as it lies on the bottom of the ocean, in this case a gray whale. After that phase, then we have some of these enrichment species come. You're starting to see this sort of fuzz, if you will, along the bottom where these guys are colonizing and growing. Then when we have this sort of emanation of sulfur compounds, then we see these critters very similar to hydrothermal vent folks grow up. And then we have again unique weird things like this guy, which is a funky kind of like a worm thing that actually essentially dissolves the bones of the whales. And that's what you're seeing here on the right. That's these guys. A fair amount of heterogeneity in terms of where these things are located, and relatively low rates of change into the sediment. Again, some of these whale falls might be there for decades or more. And so this is most interesting to us, one, from people actively trying to fish in the deep sea, but also from, as we've already talked about, this issue of deep sea mining. Because of the slow turnover of things in the deep ocean, at least we think is a relatively slow turnover, low productivity, remember, on average, except for near the hydrothermal vents and the whale falls and stuff. If we go and we disturb the benthos, say to pick up manganese nodules or something, that's very much so akin to a clear cut in a forest, right? Knock all those trees down, nuke everything, and then those trees are not going to grow back next year or 2 or 3 years, right? It's going to take a potentially long time for that ecology, that biology to recover. So when we talk about the impacts from some of these extractive activities down deep, we need to really make sure that we're being appropriate. Folks like the Cook Islands are taking the most sophisticated approach in the world right now to deep sea mining. They've said, well, there's potential, and this is right, a poor country, need resources, need to pay for stuff. So they're taking the approach of maybe we can pick a small or relatively speaking small sacrificial area where we can allow the mining to happen but not allow it elsewhere, and essentially say, yeah, we're gonna lose the the whatever biomass in this chunk of the sea floor, but we're going to keep it constrained to this one area. They've not begun deep sea mining. They're trying to create the plan for this before they fully go forward with it. Thoughts about that? What do you guys think? Somebody will find a loophole. They'll just go and mine the whole bottom of the ocean. How have we managed our fishery resources, say, here in the U.S.? Well, you guys don't know yet. We haven't talked about it. But at the broad conceptual space, did we create a huge, massive plan before we let anybody ever harvest any fish ever? No. How about our forest management? Did we have a rigorous management plan in place before we started harvesting? No. Right. Very much so. We bring in our active management of the natural resources after we realize, oh my gosh, maybe we shouldn't just have willy-nilly outright harvesting of that resource, right? So you might be a little skeptical of the Cook Islands' plan to have a sacrificial area, but to their credit, they're trying to get out in front of this, right? They're trying to get out and establish the conditions. What are the rules of the road before we start driving at least before we start actively driving down the road? That's the ideal situation. I'm not saying that the Cook Islands are necessarily perfect or they have the ideal situation, but that's what we'd like to have. We'd like to have a sense of what's going on before we start messing with stuff. It's hard to figure out how to manage our tuna stocks when we didn't start counting the tuna until we've been harvesting them for thousands of years, or at least many hundreds of years. Okay. So then just to close this one out, so the deep sea is the most prevalent habitat on Earth, midwater and deep water. We know relatively little about these areas. We're learning more all the time, but relatively little is known, primarily because they're so hard to observe, so hard to get down there with those pressures, temperatures, etc. We have overall virtually no primary productivity at the bottom of the ocean except for these areas like around the whale fall. Well, yeah, we don't even have any, except for the hydrothermal vents, we don't have any primary production. A lot of the patterns that we see in critters are dictated by these import of materials from the shallower waters primarily. We see pretty strong depth-related zonation, and the diversity is extremely high. But we don't understand these processes that control the biodiversity down deep. Why do we see the diversity of things that we see? Why don't we see more dominant critters in that community? Why are things always rare, or generally speaking rare? We don't know.